Hello, and welcome to today's University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium webinar. My name is Rosa Polito, and I am the Policy Assistant at the Society for Research in Child Development, SRCD, serving as SRCD's liaison to the consortium. We're excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Early Childhood Policy in Institutions of Higher Education. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I want to say a few words about the consortium and about using Zoom. The University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium is a network of up to 25 university-based institutions, including centers, schools, departments, and programs that have an interest in child and family policy. We are organized around three main purposes. First, to share the latest findings and strategies for conducting policy-relevant research and to facilitate collaboration across our member institutions. Second, to encourage cross-disciplinary undergraduate and graduate training to support the next generation of child and family policy researchers. And third, to foster effective translation between research, practice, and policy audiences. The consortium is run in collaboration with the Society for Research in Child Development and hosts a number of webinars each year on a variety of topics. If you are interested in learning more about the consortium, having your institution join the consortium, or if you would like to join our listserv, please see the information on this slide. Just a quick word before we begin about the technology we are using today. We are using Zoom to host this webinar. All of the attendees are muted. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A box on your screen to submit them. You can also use the Q&A box to let us know about any technical issues. The chat box is turned off for this webinar. We will submit as many questions as possible to the presenters, and any that we don't get to, we can follow up with you after. SRCD expects that all participants will be considerate and respectful in language and behavior and communicate professionally and constructively, in person and virtually. You may read SRCD's Code of Conduct and Compliance Agreement, which we will put a link to in the chat box for more information about our policy. Today's webinar is being recorded. After it ends, we will be uploading it to SRCD's YouTube channel, and we'll share that link with all registrants. Please feel free to share the link widely. And now I'll turn things over to Dave Rabar to introduce today's topic and speaker.
Hi, thanks for joining us, and thanks, Rose, for that introduction. My name is Dave Rebar. I'm a professor of economics and faculty director of the Child and Family Policy Lab at Georgia State University. On behalf of the consortium, we are especially pleased to have Professor Kathy Thornburg speak about her and Professor Linkages' work on early childhood policy in institutions of higher education. In her illustrious career, Professor Thornburg is recognized for the contributions of her research and policy efforts in the areas of early childhood programs, teacher training, school readiness, and parenting education. She is the former president of the National Association for the Education of Young Children. Her contributions to the next generation include previously teaching third grade, being a professor at the Universities of Kentucky and Missouri, directing child development labs, directing the Center for Family Policy and Research, and the Institute for Professional Development at the University of Missouri, and serving as Assistant Commissioner for the Missouri Department of Education. We're so pleased to have Kathy joining us and presenting. Kathy, it's your seminar.
Thank you so much, Dave. And the next slide will actually show, Dave mentioned Lynn Kagan as well. She is out of the country and could not get an internet connection today. I know I'll miss her, and I assume many of you know her and will miss her as well. But just know Lynn and I are in this together. So for today's presentation, just a quick overview. The next slide shows that I'll talk about the rationale and the goals, what we have accomplished today, and then with every project, of course, there are challenges. We like to think of them as good challenges and need thought partners, by the way, and then what some next steps might be. So rationale and goals. First of all, the rationale. There is a greater focus, of course, on early childhood. There's more funding. We hope there will be even more funding come our way. So that's one of our realities. And we need clarity on what an early childhood policy leader really is, and to enhance or advance the field. And we can't forget that diversity is probably one of the most important things we're doing, because we want the policy leaders to look and be like the children and the families that we serve and that the policies are being made for. And then what's at stake. Lynn and I like to refer to what we currently have in early childhood as a hodgepodge of policies and events and funding sources and so forth. But we need to really think about policies in relation to quality, equity, sustainability, and so forth. And some of our premises and strategies on the next slide will show that early childhood policy, we're really not talking about pedagogy or leadership training. Not that both of those aren't important and embedded within early childhood policy, but it's distinct from those disciplines. So we need to establish it as a field of study in and of itself. Again, a more diverse field is needed. And I'll talk a little bit more later about the importance of institutions for higher ed as it relates to establishing a new field. So we determined content for what an early childhood policy field would need, as well as some structures, funding, and outreach, and so forth. So I'll talk more about each of these later. So we have 4 goals. They sound kind of simple, but it's a challenge. But we want to prepare individuals in policy leadership roles, advance the study of early childhood policy, and this within institutions of higher ed, determine the content, and then the big one, establish a brand new field of inquiry called early childhood policy. So accomplishments to date. You can see we started our planning process in March of 2018 and worked through our planning phase, document development, considering all structures, and we're currently in our implementation phase. We have extended that, by the way, to August of 2023 and hopefully beyond that. So planning. The next slide shows our planning and design phase, and you will recognize some of these names. We couldn't have done it without this incredible group of folks who served on our advisory group. And you see the 16 folks, and we divided them into content and structure, but all 16 really worked and helped us think through this entire project from the beginning. We were so lucky to have them at the beginning, and the good news is we still have them and they are working with us on an ongoing basis. So besides getting them, we commissioned data to be done, and you can see on the in the gold, Stacy interviewed policy leaders to learn from them. Like, what do you wish you would have known before you became a policy leader? What kinds of experiences and courses and so forth do you think we should build within an early childhood policy field, and so forth? And by the way, I'm going to show you later where all of these documents I'm going to talk about are in fact available, and you can reach each of them. Excuse me. Jackie did a web search for early childhood policy, so related courses and programs in IHEs. And then Jean, the third document, was to look and see how a field emerges, how it becomes a field. And so she looked in depth at Black studies, women's studies, and environmental studies to determine how fields are built. And that actually is why we started in institutions of higher ed, because that's the way those fields started. And it actually makes sense when you stop and think about it. But we refer back to that paper and actually all of these papers as we're moving through our process. So next, we developed documents. The principles, open source, which means, of course, free. Everything we do and share is free. And really importantly, it's modifiable, as well as intended for diverse audiences. So I'll talk more about that in just a second. But first, we did modules. These modules could be picked up individually and put in economics class, a health class, child development, human development, social work, law. So it may be 2 or 3 sessions or a week's worth of content within each of these modules. And so we do have some experience. For example, Yale Law curriculum is incorporating 1 or more of these modules. So they're available for any of you to use really within any sort of course that you may be teaching. In addition, even though it's very specific with learning outcomes and so forth, we think some of the information can be used in professional development as well as in coursework. So each module, in fact, does include learning outcomes and some of content. Also, activity recommendations, a lot of readings. These will have to be updated every couple of years because we continue to get good research that we will want to include in these modules. But that's why I said they can be used within any sort of course, as well as some information for professional development. And then the content from those modules were developed into 4 3-hour credit, equivalent of 3-hour credit course syllabi. And you can see history, child development, equity, key issues, policy, leadership and advocacy, and theory, analysis, and research. So all of the information in the modules are incorporated into these syllabi, plus additional information, activities, and so forth. So they were built, if you will, on 11 to 12 weeks of class. One group I'm going to talk about in a few minutes took all the content for a certificate and put this information into 8-week sessions or 8-week courses. If you're at a semester university instead of a quarter system, then believe me, there's enough information in here to make this a 14 or 15-week syllabi. So that's important, I think. And then next, in addition, we have a policy internship handbook. One thing we learned from Stacy's research is internships are very, very important for this area. And so there's a lot of information. If you currently have internships, you will have all or most of this. But there is a really good part of this, I think, that lists many possible placements for early childhood policy in this document. And then it's important what the student needs to do, what the faculty needs to do, and what the site supervisor needs to do. So I think there's some good information that you can use in that as well. And then thirdly, we looked at our timeline. In our timeline, we looked at our structural analysis. So the next slide shows our 5 structures. I'll start at the top with online network, centers and programs, an alliance, a consortium, and outreach efforts. So first of the 5 structures, we used an RFP process and we selected the University of Washington to host an online web-based network. That houses, I mentioned all the materials that I've talked about so far. They are on, at the bottom, ecpolicy.org. They're on this website, plus much, much more. So job boards, anytime any of you have anything early childhood policy related that you want posted on this, ecpolicy.org, and we can get it posted as well. Job boards, policy updates. We have sections on recent policy articles, policy briefs, policy updates. There's a special section on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, a special section with updated research articles and briefs related to DEI that we think is very crucial. They also have webinars. I'll talk in just a minute about Policy Connect. You can see now that as of a week or so ago, there were 134, mostly faculty members on that site. And then they've outreached to APAM. We've been talking with SRCD for quite a while now, AERA and others. They have LinkedIn and other social media links that you can find on that site as well, ecpolicy.org. So, second, the funded centers. this was a very rigorous RFP process. And we really had funding only for about 4. We went back to our funders and said, there are so many really, really good applications. Please, please, can we just have a little bit more? And so we were able to fund 5 colleges and universities, both private and public, located across the state. And the next slide will show what they are in the process of building currently. This part of it has just been going on for a year. So you can imagine that they're just now building and getting courses approved and so forth. But each of these 5 has a research center, internship, symposium, and you can see the institutions that have a PhD at this point, just University of Colorado, Denver, master's degrees, and then specializations within the graduate degrees, and in some cases certificates only for those who are building it into their master's or PhD, and in some cases for a separate for non-matriculating students. And then we see the locations on our colorful map of where these 5 centers or programs are currently located. And they've all been very busy. And by the way, on that ecpolicy.org in a couple months, on December 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern, we will be having the faculty from these 5 institutions do a webinar. And so if you're interested in learning more about any of them specifically, then just know ecpolicy.org, you'll be able to find webinar information. I know December 1st seems like a long way off, but it will be here sooner than we'd like in some cases, I think. So then we have an alliance. There were quite a few universities who said, we'd really love to do this. These centers are very interdisciplinary. They have faculty from all of those different kinds of departments I mentioned earlier working together. The alliance, there might be 1 or 2 faculty who really, really became interested in early childhood policy. And so currently 8 universities are working through the Great Plains IDEA, Interactive Distance Education Alliance, to develop a 12-credit certificate, primarily based on those 4 syllabi that I talked about earlier. And so the next slide shows Iowa State, Michigan State, Texas Tech, and then universities, Arizona, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, and Nebraska. Faculty, 1 or 2 faculty from each of these institutions worked this past year to develop specifically 4 8-week courses, again, based on the materials. And now imagine this, getting 4 courses through department, college, university, you know the drill, all the way up through the committees and the systems, 4 courses at each of the 8 institutions, and a certificate approved at all institutions. And so at the bottom, you see that the hope was that this would be ready for fall of this fall, like right around the corner. I think it's going to have to be put off perhaps until the following year, because that's a lot to get through a university system, as you all will know. But how it works is the first 8 weeks of the fall semester, you might have a professor from Michigan State online. The next 8 weeks, it might be from Missouri, and so forth and so on. So you will have faculty, a student would have faculty from 4 different universities for their program, but all of the mechanics and information would come through their home university. And so it's not like they're transferring credits back and forth. So it's a pretty, Great Plains has been around for 30 plus years. So it's pretty easy to do now. So the next slide then shows in teal where the 8 institutions are located. So collectively, these are the 13 institutions that at this point, the project is working with, supporting, learning from, etc. And then the consortium is the next structure. And this is currently for the 13 institutions we're working with. So they can share lessons learned and provide challenges and just develop some energy between and among themselves, as well as what we call hot topics. And the faculty at these institutions are the ones that lead these topics based on what faculty at the 13 institutions are interested in. You can see we have one coming up in a couple of weeks on DEI. And then our fifth, thank you. I was going to say, our fifth one is outreach. So starting in the blue, Lynn and I have talked to many individuals and state leaders. We've presented at conferences even prior to COVID, actually, on in-person conferences, as well as many webinars and so forth. And then when we move into the orange, we're working with not only SRCD and NNERPP. I must say I was not familiar with that, the National Network of Education Research to Practice Partnerships, and other organizations. So we want to be partners with lots of you. And then in the pink, as you know, the syllabi and the modules are open and available for anyone and everyone in the world, actually, on that ecpolicy.org. And then Lynn and I talked to folks who are interested in beginning programs. And the green is really kind of the new. We are considering a MOOC, and that would be for non-credit bearing, like an introduction to early childhood policy. It might be 10 or 12 hours total for an introduction to early childhood policy. And then we're working hard to try to obtain scholarships for underrepresented students at each of the 13 institutions, along with the institutions working to get scholarships for underrepresented students as well. So that's where we are to date. And then, as I mentioned, we have some challenges. And if you all, by the way, have any ideas about anything I've talked about today, please put it in that Q&A, or you're going to get Lynn's and my emails at the end of this presentation. We would love to talk with you to help us with some of our challenges. So the challenges are, as it relates to quality, equity and diversity, and expansion. So first, quality. So how do we define, operationalize, and evaluate quality? So more specifically, in defining quality, okay, what should be our unit of analysis? Should it be quality for our entire initiative or for an emerging field? I mean, these are still unanswered questions in our minds. And then for operationalizing it, we think it's important to be flexible with the content, as I've suggested, but then we can worry a little bit about mission drift, and probably have little control over mission drift, but that it is a challenge that we want to think more about how to address. And then evaluating quality, should we just monitor our funded programs, or should, again, evaluate the field, the program? So this is one challenge we're dealing with. Another challenge is equity. How should we create a new field that centers around DEI, and more importantly, make it durable? So our next slide shows that the scope, our issue is how the entire initiative advances DEI without overlapping with our funded centers and our degree programs. So how can we be and then durability is key. How can it be embedded within IHEs? So this is another set of issues we're dealing with. And thirdly, then, expansion. So how could or should we expand early childhood policy? So this next slide shows, it's an idea of early childhood policies, like how much more, if any, do we need to share the idea of its importance as a field of study? What might be good strategies? And then for our efforts, what should be our next steps? Do we want more centers if we can find funding? There's been some push for international programs the MOOCs, the massive open online course that I mentioned earlier. Should we do that for an introduction? And then how should and could we look at professional development outside of the university setting? And other ideas are welcome, by the way. So, immediate next steps. We think of creating engagement as well as linkages and partnerships. So, on creating engagement, as I mentioned, everything we've shared so far is available at the ecpolicy.org, which you should have memorized by now, I guess. The policy resources, the webinars, and within Early Ed U, which is really for early childhood faculty, within their newsletter, they now have an early childhood policy IHE update within that newsletter to, again, try to spread the word beyond pedagogy, but allow all of the teachers that are part of that newsletter to become familiar with the Early Childhood Policy Initiative. Lots of social media, as I mentioned before, and once again, the website. And then at the top of that website, and I think it's a blue bar, it says Join Policy Connect. That's really a community of practice. So faculty, policy practitioners, other professionals that want to share resources or discuss strategies or bring up an issue, please help me, I need whatever, additional materials, have you found the perfect article on X, whatever, a community of practice where discussion can occur within Policy Connect. And so as I mentioned, it's at the very same ecpolicy.org, but there is a special button that says Join Policy Connect. And I believe on an earlier slide, there are about 150 or so people, I think it said, currently in Policy Connect. So for the rest of the time, and I know you have question and answer capabilities or questions. So we are really interested in how can we interact with SRCD? What are some possible linkages? Is there a way to collaborate to help enhance our work and your work to further the early childhood policy field? So I hope you have some questions that you'll put in the Q&A box. And why don't we go to the last slide? And then if you want to come back to this question slide, that would be great. But we must thank Heising Simons, Buffett Early Childhood Fund, and Bezos Family Foundation, because without their funding, this work would not have started or continued. And again, I mentioned those are the emails to reach Lynn and myself. And I don't know if you want to go back to the question slide, but would love to continue this conversation. And Dave, I think maybe it's your turn to take over now.
Well, not to take over, but to facilitate. Thank you so much, Kathy. That was really wonderful to hear about all these efforts. People in the audience are really interested in the modules and materials that your group has prepared, and they've asked a couple questions about those. This first one, I'm pretty sure that you've answered already, but I didn't want to let this one go by. You've mentioned ecpolicy.org several times. Are all the materials available at ecpolicy.org?
Correct, they are.
Okay, and that's
including
ecpolicy.org, right?
Right, ecpolicy.org, including the commission papers, all the modules, the syllabi, the internship handbook, and then all of those other resources that I mentioned, DEI readings, research briefs, all of that is on the ECP network at the University of Washington, yes.
That's fantastic. Another question that came in about the materials asks about whether the course syllabi materials are appropriate for undergraduate courses or just graduate courses.
They were actually developed with graduate students in mind. Each university can, of course, adapt them in any way possible. I can imagine if I were teaching a senior level course with related to policy, I would certainly draw from the modules and or the syllabi and to develop an undergraduate, an upper level undergraduate course, but they were developed with that in mind. So it might need some tweaking, but I do think that parts of it could be pulled out and adapted so seniors could have an introduction to early childhood policy.
Thank you. So the field, this new field of early childhood policy is interdisciplinary. And you're drawing on lessons from other interdisciplinary fields that have been developed. What tools or advice is ECPIHE developing to help faculty contribute to early childhood policy, but to also address professional and other concerns that might arise from them being housed in other departments?
Yeah, that's a good question. The 5 centers that I mentioned are housed in different centers and or different departments with faculty, in some cases from 2 or 3 different departments on campus, but in some of the centers, there are faculty from 4 or 5 different disciplines that have all contributed to building that degree program or that certificate at that institution. And so they are getting students from a wide variety, from all of their disciplines. And the faculty sometimes will be co-teaching some of the courses. The syllabi and modules were actually developed with interdisciplinary in mind. And I mentioned earlier that Yale Law School, for example, is pulling from some of the modules and adapting it. So we had that in mind from the beginning, that it's not just early childhood education, but it's also child development, it's human development, it's economics, it's law, it's social work. You can't do early childhood policy and think narrowly in just one of those units, because what do we make policies about? We make them about licensing, early childhood programs. We have health, we have parenting aid, we have so many different policies as it relates to young children and their families that we had to think interdisciplinary. And so I know the universities that are involved are going to be recruiting students from all of these different programs across campus, and their seminars will be broad-based for across campus and lots of different disciplines. And as I mentioned, some of the centers are actually already housed in interdisciplinary units. So I do think that, I know some universities are actually giving some funding if faculty from various departments start working together. And I think this kind of is a precursor to that in terms of what we had in mind from the very beginning. So we couldn't do this with just early childhood ed faculty or just one discipline, because our kids and families, as we all know, these policies that are being made now are so broad-based for the health and well-being of young children and their families. But we do define, by the way, young children as prenatal through 3rd grade. So the children up to about age 8 or 9 is what we're considering early childhood in this case. So if some people wanted it to go through 5th grade, whatever, there's adaptation, and that's what modification is all about. But that's what our early childhood definition is. Did I answer that question? Or is there more?
That sounds great. That
Okay.
sounds really helpful. We've got some questions about the courses and certificates. The first one comes from the audience, from somebody who's soon to be graduating, congratulations, with a PhD, but is interested in getting some of the course content. Is it possible for somebody to take the course right now if they aren't a graduate student or aren't enrolled at one of the institutions that you're working with?
Yes. What I would say about that is, I know in 2 or 3 of the center institutions, they are offering courses. So I can't imagine a university not allowing a person just to sign up and enroll for a course. and not a degree program, of course. And then when the certificate from the Alliance begins, that was really set to be for two groups. The first group would be if you're in a master's or PhD program, you can build this certificate in these 4 courses. Or if someone is developing policy at a state department, say in Department of Health or Education or whatever, and they want more information, then the certificate can be taken just as a certificate, not as a degree granting program. And I know a couple of the centers are also working on certificates, but yes, I would say it's one course. If you look at that chart that we had and find a university, or just email me and we'll give you, or Lynn, and we'll give you the name of the faculty member at each of those institutions to contact and see if they're having a course. And I'm sure they'd love to have anybody and everybody enrolled in that course.
So, and that raises a more general question. Several of the participants in today's webinar are graduate students. Some are beginning graduate students. Some, like the person who asked the last question, are farther along. What's your advice to graduate students who are interested in early childhood policy, and more generally, or more specifically, interested in ECPIHE?
So if they're an early graduate student, as far as I know now, to get any of the courses, they would have to enroll as a non-matriculating student and work with their advisor to see if they took a course somewhere else, then if they could build it into their program of study. And I think that would be possible at almost any place. But to actually get the certificate, for example, through the Alliance, it would have to come through one of those 8 institutions and then transfer from that one institution back into wherever their home institution is for either a course or a certificate. I would say if someone's just interested in knowing and learning more about this particular initiative and how they might be involved, I'd say give Lynn or me a call. We'd love to talk to anybody about, think through with anybody about what else should we be thinking about, first of all, and how we could help or support in any way.
That sounds great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask a somewhat selfish question. And that question is your organization working on new outlets, so new publication outlets for early childhood policy scholarship?
You know, we do know that fields have outlets for publication. And as you hopefully can tell, we've been working really hard on content and degree and certificate programs and so forth. So our hope is that initially the faculty in these institutions and others interested in early childhood policy will publish in their mainstream outlets first. But then that's a great question. I think we haven't thought clearly about that yet. I think we need to think about, especially now with so many online journals and stuff, we need to think about, is there a specific journal in the future? If not, are there existing journals that could have a policy section or a policy column or something in major journals? So again, we thank you for the question, but we haven't thought it through clearly enough. So maybe we'll contact you and get some more ideas.
Maybe a future webinar.
Exactly, exactly.
So another question's come in. I'm going to split this in two. The first is if someone wanted to adapt one of the courses or modules that you designed, is there a formal process for doing that?
Really good question. Yes and no. No, mainly. We do have on ecpolicy.org, when you look at the modules and so forth, there's a little paragraph that we would like you to use saying that it was adapted from this project. But in terms of approval or anything like that, we're here to answer questions and help support in any way, but we're not here to say, oh no, you shouldn't do that, or you should do it this way. Adapt them and then use that little paragraph, if you would, on the syllabus, and we'd be happy.
Thank you. And then following up on that and sort of at a higher level, do you have a formal process for institutions to become involved as partners or in some other affiliation with your organization?
Okay, as you heard, we've reached out to a lot of professional organizations such as SRCD, which of course include a lot of faculty, but in terms of a process for other IHEs, here's where we are. And as I mentioned in one of our challenges, how should we be expanding? So should we, well, one thing we're committed to is to find more funding for minority serving institutions. Because again, as I've mentioned several times, DEI is so important in this project. And so should we find additional funding, then it's possible that we, clearly you can tell the answers, I don't know, but I'm going to keep talking for a minute. Should we be inviting other institutions of higher ed with some funding to be part of the consortium or develop new centers? And maybe the answer is yes. It would be an RFP process, just as we did earlier. It was very competitive, which is good. As we work with minority serving institutions, hopefully in the future with some funding and some support, that would be another method for a variety of minority serving institutions. We have some Hispanic speaking institutions now, but we want to go broader than that, of course. We've done a scan of all the MSIs. So next on our list, we hope to find some funding and ways to figure out how to support early childhood policy within some of those. But just in terms of general universities around the way, that's one of our good challenges in terms of whether we want additional institutions. If so, would it look similar to how we started it, or is now time to maybe give less funding to more institutions? How are we going to do this? We don't know. So Dave and others, we'd love further conversations about this because it's crucial. I mean, to develop a field, you know, we've already been at this. I think this is year 4, and we're probably going to need 10 years, you know, before it's said and done. So we'd love other ideas on that. But right now we're thinking about minority serving institutions and would like further conversations on how to involve more IHEs, more partners in this effort.
Thank you. So in that answer and in the presentation, you described diversity, equity, and inclusion as a good challenge for your organization. We know all about some of the structural impediments to diversity and inclusion in existing academic disciplines. The development of a new field seems like a great opportunity to get it right with respect to DEI, you know, right from the start. How is your organization incorporating diverse voices and perspectives? And how is it incorporating non-academic and community stakeholders?
Yeah, again, you have such good questions. As I mentioned, we did start with a scan just to find out how many and locations of all of our minority serving institutions that we will continue to work with. But we just are now in the process of developing a DEI work group. We have selected a person to lead that group and have started conversations about who should be on that group. It would, you know, considering faculty, researchers, and others to serve on that group. And we know it's not a short-term fix. We know to institutionalize it, this is going to be a work group we have throughout the rest of our existence. So if you or anyone on this webinar has ideas, interest, or whatever, again, just write to Lynn or me, because we're just now developing it, because I love the part of your question that said to do it right. So we are ready to start a DEI work group, and in fact, we want to do it right, so the result is right, established, institutional, and getting folks in important policy decisions that come from a wide, that look like our country. So this is extremely important question, and again, would love additional ideas, but we are just beginning. Well, I say we're just beginning, excuse me, Dave, I say we're just beginning, and that's on this formal mechanism. We started from the beginning thinking DEI. Of course, I mentioned we have a whole section on our network, ecpolicy.org, and the courses and the modules were built not only with interdisciplinary issues in mind, but also with DEI in mind. So it's not like we're just starting thinking about it, but we're just now starting the work group, which can take us to the next level to get it right, we hope.
Thanks for clarifying that and adding to the answer. Faculty at institutions of higher education typically have workloads that incorporate teaching and scholarship, which you've talked about a lot in the presentation, but also of service. The presentation discussed ways to advance the unique teaching and scholarship needs for early childhood policy. But could you talk more about the possible unique service needs for the early childhood policy field, and whether and how your organization is addressing those? And I'm especially interested, given that you've worn multiple hats at different times. So you've been, on the service side. Administering organizations, but also administering organizations outside academia.
Right. Well, we obviously did start with teaching and research efforts in mind and less about service, but I think it's a good time to start thinking about that. And, part of that is outreach. I know some of the faculty at the 13 institutions, we're thinking about conference presentations and so forth, which of course would be in the service arena. And then as we build internships in communities, each of these institutions, I think there will be some quote service opportunities that emerge for faculty to become more involved and be on, teaching research, be on their service side of their 20% or whatever their faculty appointment is. But beyond that, we really haven't thought about anything specifically as it relates to the service, other than the outreach mechanisms that we know are so important. And I know sometimes in working with other units on campus, symposia, et cetera, each institution will count different things as their service component. So again, we're open for ideas, but that's the thinking we've had up to this point as it relates to the service component.
Thank you. Your organization and this initiative were just getting off the ground, just starting to come together when COVID hit. So how has COVID affected your timeline, maybe altered the goals that you've set for the organization, and just generally affected things within this?
We see all the time, and in so much of the literature we read, it's like the effect of COVID. And COVID has certainly affected all of us in so many ways. But since this project, Lynn lives in Connecticut, works in New York, I'm in Missouri. These centers and alliance members, the faculty, as you saw, are all over the country. So we have had 2 in-person meetings in all of those years. We are Zoomies, I guess you would call us, because all of our work really has been Zoom. So other than the fact of not being able to get together in person quite as often as we would like, I don't think it really has slowed down our work as much as in so much other parts of our life where it's been affecting us, because we just keep moving on down the road, so to speak. It will be fun when we can get together a little more often, but I don't think it really slowed us down. I'd never thought about it before, but maybe Lynn would have had a different answer, but I feel really good about how we've been moving on our goals and continuing to look for additional funding to expand, as I say, to some of our challenges, worry with our challenges and so forth. But maybe this is just one part of our lives that didn't get so affected by COVID.
Oh, that's great. So one last question. During the presentation, you provided a really detailed schema for how internships should operate. How central do you think internships should be to this new field? Do you think that they should be requirements for both master's level and PhD level education in this field?
I think the policy leaders we interviewed thought they should be, and they would have some places to have it. I do think it's very important because that's where the real world, you can see how policies are made. So the coursework you've had and other experiences and how it's really done. I would hope at minimum in a graduate program that there could be a summer internship, or even at minimum a 3-credit internship that can be done more locally if it's done during a regular semester. So I do see them as very important. Now the certificate, which will have people from all over the country, that the Alliance is building, has the 4 courses content. There's not a separate internship with that. However, the faculty from those institutions worked really hard to put more experiences into each of those 4 courses, so it could be kind of a very weak internship, if you will. But I do think it's really important, and if someone's starting this from scratch, I think building an internship in is very important.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation, for answering all these questions. Before we turn things back over to Rose, is there anything else that you want to get across or communicate?
No, I would just say if we could go to that last slide again. I know this is taped and you can get it, but please just feel free to reach out to Lynn and me with any ideas, any questions. Give us a call. You can find our numbers when you email us, because this has been quite fun. You've been a great group, and Dave, you and the others have great questions. So Lynn and I both thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you. And Rose, do you want to close?
Yes, thank you. So
Thanks, Rose.
thank you again, everyone who joined us today, and especially to our speakers, Kathy and our moderator, Dave, for such a thought-provoking presentation. And if you like today's webinar, you may be interested in future consortium webinars. So as you can see, our next webinar will be on June 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern, and the topic will be the effects of COVID-19 on working families. And as well, you may want to join the consortium listserv. So you can do that by visiting this website that I just put into the chat. And another thing that we want to open to you all is if you have an idea for a webinar topic that you'd like us to consider, you can visit the consortium community on SRCD Commons, or you can email either Dave, whose email address is on the screen, or Shaniqua, who's another member of the consortium steering committee. And in my follow-up email, I will also provide a link to the webinar recording, and that will be posted to SRCD's YouTube channel. If you have any questions about the consortium, you can feel free to email me. My email address is r.ippolito@srcd.org. And last, again, we just want to thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of the day.
And thank you, Rose.